Okay, we are recording. So we wanted to kick off the webinar by providing some historical context to better understand the environmental and social context that gave rise to the mobilization of women's advocates. This is not an exhaustive timeline by any means. Some timelines that I found tracked this movement all the way to the 1500s. So I wanted to acknowledge that. But when I was creating this timeline, I started to pick up on some common themes and connections. You'll see that like every movement, it isn't birthed in isolation. And the way that I see it, what became known as the battered women's movement was made possible by 4 other movements: the civil rights movement, anti-war, and Black liberation movements. This really set the foundation and the ability to talk about oppression that was happening inside the home, which was enabled by oppressive systems. You start to see a significant shift in the 1960s, especially when it comes to bringing what was thought of as a private family matter to places like a courtroom and engaging the legal system. These forms of violence, I also see an interconnection with other forms of violence like rape and sexual violence. Many of these forms, human and sex trafficking, sexual exploitation, rape, child abuse, relationship violence, all of these different forms are cut from the same cloth. But now in 2020, you'll see that many of these issues are siloed, even though many developments and advancements are happening concurrently and benefiting many of the same people, if that makes sense. So that brings us to the 1970s, nearly 50 years ago now. You're seeing more women identifying with the battered women's movement. You see more funding for emergency shelters, more international conferences, and consciousness raising about the violence that's occurring in people's homes, including a book and movie that was based off a true story, The Burning Bed. I didn't link it. It should be on there when I send it out, if you're curious in learning more. And then a more more modern depiction of domestic violence came out earlier this year, actually, called Invisible Man. So I think if you watch those two back to back, you can start to see how, as a society, we've grown to learn more about the dynamics, impacts, and psychology of domestic violence. So I think this timeline has really set the stage for us to talk more about what was going on in the 70s, particularly in Minnesota. So I'll let Lauren go ahead and kick that off. Oh, you're muted, Lauren.
No, I'm unmuted. Good morning, everybody. So yes, Women's Advocates it's been storied that we were the first domestic violence shelter in the country, but we kept hearing about other organizations that were also given that name, and we thought we should all talk to each other and see where that term came from and why it was important to say that. So we called the other firsts around the country. We all kind of started around the same time, separately. These were not coordinated movements. They were happening and spurring through the movements that Brenisen was just talking about. Out in San Francisco, there's La Casa de las Madres. We have the Women's Center and Shelter in Greater Pittsburgh that they started right around 1975. And then Transition House in Cambridge started. And each of them were started by a group of volunteers who were women, some of whom were survivors of domestic violence. Others were simply concerned that there was an inequality with the way genders were participating in relationships. And so the Transition House has a book about their history, and it's fascinating, and you can contact them online for a copy. We also have a book as well called The Story of a Shelter. And if anyone wants to, please just email Brenisen and we'll send you a copy. We don't sometimes, they are for sale on Amazon, but we'll just send copies for free. But this book was written by a collective of women. There's no byline on this book, and that is really representative of the other movements that were happening around the country, that these were not hierarchical organizations. These organizations started as collectives. A lot of them saw hierarchy as a symbolism of the patriarchy and wanted to have non-top-down organizations, but rather organizations that were impacted by by the community around them and wanted to respond in turn. So each of these organizations had similar experiences in the sense that they were starting something new. A lot of these cities, St. Paul included, did not have shelters for homeless women to go to. There were, I believe, 32 places for homeless men to go to in the Twin Cities back then, and there was no place for homeless women to go to. So that was one concern. The same concern at the same time in our state, in Minnesota, was that they had defunded the women's, I believe that they were workhouses and mental homes. And so what they did there was they basically just kind of let these women who were being sheltered and receiving some form of intervention from the government related to their emotional and mental health wellness needs, and they were just released, just allowed to kind of go somewhere not there, which meant that places like Women's Advocates and the other places across the country were doubly important, because not only did homeless women and women who were no longer housed because of the lack of inpatient mental health services long-term, people needed a place to go. And what we were finding out is that the common thread between these two groups of people was that domestic violence had impacted their lives and had rendered them homeless or in need of ongoing mental health issues. We found out that the same thing had been happening with women's correctional facilities. And that's a common thread that exists still today, is that with the homeless communities and communities that are providing mental health resources and communities that are providing correctional places, the women's prisons, the people who are at these places have experienced domestic violence at far greater rates than traditional populations, which causes us to feel that once domestic violence is a part of your life and you are victimized by it, it starts to impact so many other parts of your life, to the point to where employment, your civil status, your economic status, your housing status are all negatively affected. So what came from that was a shelter at Women's Advocates. At the transition house, obviously, that's transitional housing. So we started a shelter. We started a crisis line. Thanks, Brenisen, for the next slide. What happened was we actually started the crisis line first, because the legal system had noticed that there were a couple of female lawyers at the Ramsey County Legal Aid, and they kept getting sent the women's issues cases because they're ladies. So all the female lawyers were pretty much getting a concentrated list of women's issues cases. And then they realized that the common thread was that women needed safety from their partners, from their husbands, from their boyfriends or abusers in intimate partner relationships. So they started a crisis line to kind of work with the legal aid assistance line. So kind of like a second line that you could call on the phone. And then they just separated that. Someone was operating the crisis line out of their apartment, just a few blocks down from where Women's Advocates is today. And the more that people were calling into the crisis line, the more they were asking for a place to go. They needed to escape. They needed to physically escape. Resources were helpful, but they mostly needed a place to go to. At the time, the police department did not believe that domestic violence existed. They saw it as a relationship issue that needed to be put back under control by the man in the relationship. So we had zero support from the police department, and the police chief at the time actually took significant umbrage with our existence. We were called the Runaway Wives Club as a joke from city leadership at the time. So the people who were running this crisis line out of their apartment started to allow women to stay in that apartment who were calling, because they knew there was zero other additional resources. And then one day, a neighbor in that apartment building found a diaper in the trash can. And this was a child-free apartment building. And so the woman who was volunteering for this effort got evicted from her apartment, and they quickly started to hop around to other places where they could go to for the crisis line and for this sleep on our floor, come as you will shelter system that they had. And then they finally were able to cobble together enough donations by using those same phones for the crisis line to call out to ask for donations, and got enough money to start a shelter. So that was in 1974. Similar efforts took place across the Casa de los Padres and the Pittsburgh Center, and then the Transition House, where they had to start doing a service at the behest of the city leadership and at the behest of the law enforcement. So what happened was we've paved the way, not we, but the volunteers at the time paved the way for not just city changes on how the police are using our existence to further hurt the women that were coming to seek safety from us by they would get the reports for missing persons from their husbands, and then the police chief would send a police officer down to our shelter and see if the women were there, and then call back to the men to say, oh, I found your wife, your property. She is at Women's Advocates. Here's the address. And because of that, we had some significant hardship and trouble through, I can't even tell you the stories. They're very upsetting. So we needed help. We needed to go bigger than just the shelter. We needed to tell the system that this was bigger than the police's frustrations with Women's Advocates' existence. So the Shelter Appropriation Act was passed in 1978 due to a lot of lobbying to say, listen, we need to have places for women to go that are safe. This needs to be a public safety response. Now we've kind of evolved to have it be considered a public health response. But at the time, they got to the part where they said, no, women deserve to be safe and they are not the property of their boyfriends or husbands. And so, unfortunately, there's some things that we wanted to do that we didn't do. And now I'm going to fast forward just for half a second to say that there were lessons that we learned now that we wish we would have put into action back then. And I've spoken with some of the founders of Women's Advocates, and basically they came together in a stunning display of mutual aid. This is a quote from Betsy. They wanted to do something about violence against women when the system completely ignored it. And they feel like they didn't reach high enough or far enough for the resources and mostly the power to stop it. They went to the part where people were getting hurt, not to the part where you had to convince society that women don't deserve to be hurt. But they went to that pain point. And what some of the founders are seeing now is that what we're going through with the questioning of power, especially what's happening within the last couple of weeks with the movements that have been happening and the youthful vitality that's happening, and even discussions with some of the founders that we have now about what is a woman, what is domestic violence, where does gender play a role in this, or is it about power and gender is one of the vehicles for this power to take place? We're really taking a second run at this right now, and it's invigorating to see all of the new voices and different challenges to the way we've tried this 45 years ago. So it's really exciting where we are today, and there's just so many parallels between what was happening in 1974 and what's happening right now. So we had the passage of the Domestic Abuse Act back in 1978-ish. And that is kind of where we need to learn some lessons. Need to learn some lessons about how law enforcement is invited into our homes when we need help. It invites us to see how the disbalance of justice is served, especially in terms of how Black lives are protected versus white lives or other, the communities that might be marginalized, especially from the eyes of the law enforcement. So we're taking a second run at this right now. And for anybody who's interested in learning more, we'll get to that in the later part of the presentation. But thanks for letting me ramble, Brenisen.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just actively listening right there. So thank you so much for your perspective. So similarly to what Lauren has already alluded to, there has been a lot that has evolved since the 70s, and that is indicative by a lot of different things, but you can see it in the language that we use. So on the left here, you'll see a little table that was developed by Violence Free Minnesota, which is our statewide coalition here in Minnesota. And even their name is representative of the changes of what we are kind of headed in a certain direction. So Violence Free Minnesota, our state coalition, used to be called Minnesota Coalition for Battered Women. And since then, and you can read on their website of why they made that name change, but they put together this list, and I want to do a quick poll. We won't spend too much time on this, but just to see what terms you all are most familiar with and use regularly. So I'm going to launch that just to get us all in the headspace of what terms are we most familiar with. Do we have questions about what direction we're going in? And then on the right, you'll also see some links to some different models that have been developed over time to better understand what domestic violence is, who experiences it, what are the dynamics, how can we help. So I just added those links for you to explore after if you'd like to learn more about how it's changed over the past few years. Okay, so it looks like a lot of people recognize domestic violence. Not a lot of relationship violence, which is the preferred term that Violence Free Minnesota uses. Yeah, so not too much for wife beater and battered women. Those terms are pretty dated right now. We don't really use them as much, so that is definitely reflected here. Okay, I'll give it 3 more seconds for people to kind of add in their familiarity. And if there's others that you think are important to note here as well, feel free to add those in the chat. Okay, I'm going to share the results. So a lot of people are familiar with the term domestic violence, absolutely. And that's the term that we kind of use here as well. If you want to learn more about kind of the different models and things, there's the Duluth model. A lot of things happened in Minnesota. So if you're from Minnesota or in Minnesota, you definitely have a reason to kind of be proud of being at the forefront of this movement. But kind of keep that in mind as we go forward of everything's constantly evolving and we're continuing to learn more, which Lauren's going to discuss next about kind of the evolution of our organization.
Yeah, thank you, Brenisen. So, yes, we have, at the time, as I spoke about earlier, we were really greeting domestic violence at the pain point of when someone had been injured or threatened or caused to that part to where when we actually created a little bit of a cycle of violence where we'd say the honeymoon period and then the calm and then the instigation period and then the reaction and then the apology period. And we really, we needed to describe it that way so we could let people know that domestic violence isn't constantly injuring someone or constantly threatening someone, that there are happy moments, there's calm moments, there's worrisome moments, and there's that panic of, did I overreact? That he's really sorry about what he did, and apologies again for using the he/she difference. But again, that's kind of where we were back then, and you can see how that's persisted over time, as using the he/she concept of battering and injuring people. But what we saw is that we needed to address those things because that's where the pain points were, and that's where the most justice needed to be most immediately addressed. And once we got to the point to where we had a system in place, a legal system in place that said, yes, here's an office that you can go to, here's an order for protection that you can fill out and receive to get protection from the law enforcement. So it's not a he said, she said, if you have to call the police for help, that you have a document that says, I am in trouble when this person is around me. So you don't have to convince the police of anything. So the basic concepts of what we thought justice looked like at the time were put into place, and that's what we had for a long time. Over the past 45 years, we've definitely developed more of an understanding that domestic violence and intimate partner violence can take place in a variety of forms. Sometimes when you go beyond intimate partner violence, you could talk about interfamilial violence in the home. You can have intimate partner relationship violence where you have the same sex partnership, or you do have a heterosexual relationship where the tables are turned. No, so we don't want to discount a variety of experiences, but definitely the things that we found is that male privilege and the power that our community puts behind being a cisgendered male is what drives a lot of sometimes that entitlement to behave in that way. So we need to really balance it. And that's kind of where we are right now. I'm skipping ahead, but there's a struggle that we have, especially within the movement, to say, no, this is about women being hurt by men, and that's not fair, versus, but a lot of people are hurt. And we need to see this as a power dynamic thing, and more of a something that needs to address the power and the balance in a relationship. So we still struggle with that, but that friction is good within the movement because we need to be able to talk about it. But I'm going to back up to what has persisted. We have found through the years of social service, really since the 70s, since a lot of social service organizations came to fruition, that homelessness and domestic violence can intertwine. One causes the other, one perpetuates the other, one makes the other one kind of rewind back and go back to the beginning. And even today, when you are answering our crisis line 24 hours a day, you'll hear someone who's calling for help. They've been told to call us because they're in a violent relationship, but they're not feeling that. They're feeling the threat of homelessness. The threat of homelessness is caused by the power and control that's held by their partner that's threatening whether they get to stay there or not. And that's why they're scared. But what's in the person's head when they're fearful about what they need is, will they have a place to sleep? They've been told that that's the only place that they can go. And so while you're in the middle of a violent relationship and you're worried about housing, you're calling for housing. And so we need to understand that within the domestic violence movement, that it may look like homelessness, and you may think, they're scamming us. They're not really domestic violence victims. They're homeless and they're just looking for a place to sleep. If you stop that ugly voice and back up and think about what's going on in that person's world when they're calling, it's very much sometimes within the mixture of a very threatening and scary relationship that's caused the person to wonder about where they're going to sleep. So we have to constantly remind ourselves of that as an emergency shelter provider and as a crisis line operator, that the two often are so intertwined, it's hard to see what's going on. And so what we do, we have thought about this, that we walk with victim survivors, we walk with them. So that's where Women's Advocates is, that wherever you are in the journey, we understand it probably feels pretty messed up. I want to swear so bad right now. It's been a rough couple of weeks. But we need to be there with them even when we're getting the ugly side of it. That doesn't quite jive with our mission statement or with our stated goals as an organization for safety for victims. Sometimes we're getting a lot of complex situations that come our way, and we just need to calm ourselves as advocates and just be with the people who are seeking help from us. They need about 20,000 different types of help, and whatever that one of the 20,000 is that comes out of their mouth when they're in a heightened state, that's what we listen to, that's what we believe, and it is going to be messy and complex. And so what we have to do is constantly train ourselves, constantly be aware, and really recognize that when we started, we had a concept as women's advocates that there is no such thing as a professional advocate. We are all advocates. We are all advocates for safety and equality and equal access to happiness and peace. And now we have an entire cadre of people who are professionals in the advocacy world. We have professionalized what it takes, what it looks like. And what a lot of the professionalization at Women's Advocates is trying to understand how we can untangle the systemic oppressions that have caused women to get to the point to calling our crisis line. We are professionals at helping people jump over one barrier after another, because we understand how the barriers are, how they work, how they support each other, and how they keep mostly women who come to us from having the safety and wellness that they need. So sorry again, Brenisen, it took way too much time. But yeah, that's a little bit about where we are now.
Absolutely, thank you. So continuing in that same vein of what do we do, what does that look like in practice right now? The model that we kind of use to describe it is this continuum of safety from abuse. So we'll kind of break down these three different parts. Lauren has absolutely alluded a lot to this acute care realm. So we'll kind of focus this next section on prevention and then sustained safety. So I'm going to do another poll. So here it is right now about prevention. So this is how we conceptualize where we want to address domestic violence. So where we live, learn, work, and gather. So my question to you is, which of these are you most interested in learning a little bit more about? And I'll speak for just a few minutes on whichever one is in the top voted. Okay, right now in the community is predominant. Okay, cool. Well, let's start talking about that first. So for our in the community where we gather, that kind of fits in with any of these places in between. That's not necessarily where a certain person works or where they go to school or where they're housed. So this can be places where they kind of seek support or refuge for the community, where people gather. It can be a group of other activists like those in the 70s who want to make a difference. So we go to a lot of different social justice groups or volunteer programs or philanthropic kind of oriented organizations. We've gone to, I guess just to name a couple, there's been, Moms Demand Action Against Gun Violence, understanding the intersection between gun violence and domestic violence. Those who are working with women in correctional facilities, we know that a disproportionate amount of especially women of color have been victimized in the sense of domestic violence and are imprisoned, whether that's related to protecting themselves or not. Religious organizations, different churches, different religious groups, Bible studies. They're interested in how can we, a lot of people turn to faith as a source of hope and as a source of, feeling connected to something greater than themselves. And it can also be used as a weapon. So like, how do we hold those two truths and help mobilize the community that they might turn to for support to be equipped with the knowledge and the resources to support someone? The second one that I'm seeing, I'm going to end the polling and share it so you all can see what I'm seeing. The second one is in school. So I'll briefly talk about that. We're going to have another webinar about our work in engaging youth next week. So be sure to check that out. We'll have the links for that and everything. But a little bit about that. We know that dating violence starts as young as 12 years old. So we're in classrooms that start at 6th grade and up. And a lot of colleges that we go to, the students will say, oh my gosh, I wish I would have known about this when I was in middle school or when I was in high school. So we do a lot of not only identifying what is an abusive relationship, what is family violence, but how do we replace those unhealthy or abusive behavioral patterns or decisions with more healthy ones. So definitely learn more about that in the next webinar. But that's just a little bit about our prevention efforts. Okay, so moving on to our acute care. So again, Lauren talked a lot about this, but kind of just breaking down what are the different components of when someone comes to our shelter, what is accessible to them, how do we support them? These are just some things. So we have different programs for supporting with employment, helping them find jobs, helping them with resumes. We have a little tech center. They can use the computers there. Legal support. So we have 3 people who are certified application assistants for the stay-at-home program. So securing a safe, confidential address. A lot of different states have that as well. So I definitely look into that. Public assistance, housing, mental health therapy, drop-in childcare, children's management, and enrolling children in school, making sure that they are supported in that way as well. So we'll have more resources at the end to learn more about the experiences of people who hold these different positions, but just wanted to give a little more insight on that.
Yeah. And so, thank you, Brenison. Yeah, what happened, the way we transitioned from providing a crisis line and a shelter was really recognizing that um, when we started 45 years ago, it was never the idea that someone would escape their relationship forever. The concept was definitely that someone just needed to bail for a minute while their partner was heated. Uh, so they would eventually go back after they had a little bit of intervention. We've graduated to the concept of leaving a violent relationship for good. And sometimes that's a good idea. And what we found over 45 years of advocacy is sometimes that's a really challenging idea that is very complicated and sometimes more difficult to handle, which is tough to consider, especially as we're safety advocates. Like, why would you send someone back to the person who caused so much trouble? Um, but it is very complicated. I'm sure as a lot of people who are listening in are very familiar about. So we kind of realized that for those who intend to leave for good, you don't just need shelter. You have lost some. A lot of people have lost their jobs when they are in a violent relationship for a number of reasons. You have lost your connections through the isolation that you experienced in the relationship. So, and you have had financial difficulties and control and lack of access to finances, and sometimes even legal difficulties. We find a lot of abusers have used their victims or victim survivors' social security number for credit cards or encourage them to incur debt on the behalf of their partner. So it's you can't just pick yourself up by the old bootstraps and head on out to your new life after you've escaped. Um, and especially considering the institutional and systemic racism that affects our community in St. Paul. I don't know about the communities that everyone lives in and works in across, but in St. Paul, we have some significant gaps in access to resources that are along racial lines. So in St. Paul, we are in the historic Rondo neighborhood that has been devastated through years of systemic racism. And they put a highway in the middle of the historic Black neighborhood and basically cut out maybe 4 whole blocks running down a few miles of a length of a community, cut them right in half. And then over years, the community has just been challenged. So the people who are seeking help from our emergency shelter not only are from the neighborhood that has been challenged so significantly over the past decades, but also are experiencing individual outcomes of systemic racism and discrimination that takes place. The women who come to our shelter, 91% of them are Black or multiracial women. And they have told us about how you can't just go to look at a property that you want to rent. The landlord will see that you're a Black woman and not rent to you. And you dare not take your children with you when you're going to look for an apartment, because the landlord will see your children and definitely not rent to you. So the challenges that we face today in 2020 cause us to realize that we need to do some intervention out in the community for domestic violence. And that means intervention related to getting people into housing when the system is not really quite allowing for that to be easy. We 2009, when we did the rapid rehousing thing, a lot of places went for rapid rehousing funding. We were able to get some rental subsidies for about 3 months' time. We realized at Women's Advocates that 3 months is not a good amount for someone who's putting everything in their life back together. We really need more of kind of a transitional housing model, but in a scattered site way that goes from 6 months to 2 years time, depending on how much you need. We've kind of settled in at about 1 year of support, where we have about 40 people a year who are leaving our shelter, who are adults, access rental subsidies for their support, continued advocacy, continued access to mental health resources, continued access to legal support, and all of those things put together kind of act as if our shelter were still acting and available to them, just on their own terms in their own home, when they can make their own meals and set their own schedule and live their own lives in a place that is in their name, building a year's worth of positive leasing experiences, a year's worth of good credit building, just to kind of overcome some of the hurdles that have been made possible. And one of the things that Brenisen had alluded to in the prevention thing wraps around back to this, in that we need landlords who get it. And what Brenisen and I found out a year ago is when we presented to a group of 150 landlords, we came in there thinking, we're going to teach them a thing or two about domestic violence and how it impacts the tenant community. And we realized that most of the landlords in that room knew a lot about domestic violence. They had accidentally become advocates themselves and knew a great deal about crisis intervention in terms of applications of what works and what doesn't. And so we realized that we needed to increase how much we understood about what landlords get about domestic violence and how it impacts tenants, and really just giving them the resources to be the advocates that they were already being anyways. So through that, we found about a dozen landlords who get it to the point to where they save spots for us at Women's Advocates for when people are leaving our shelter. And if anybody wants to know about that model, we love to talk about this more. I don't need to take up any more time for the webinar, but please email us and we'll send you kind of a synopsis of how this program works, because everybody should be doing it. It seems to work really well for the people that we serve. All right, so you can kind of see what Women's Advocates looks like right here. We are a hierarchical organization. In order to get funding from the United Way in 1980, we had to become a hierarchical organization with a board of directors that is volunteers, that doesn't have any staff on it. When we were a collective, we had staff, participants, and volunteers all in this group together that were making decisions by consensus. And it took hours to make any decision, but they were proud of that. But to get the funding, we are a traditionally funded organization through a combination of governmental grants, through Office of Justice programs, and the HUD grant, and then also a lot of philanthropic support that we are fortunate to receive. So today we have a board of directors of 12 volunteers, an executive director, the classic support team of the directors of finance, the development programs, and then we have our facilities team that manages our shelter. And that gives everything from landscaping to 3 meals a day to the security systems and room turnover. And then we have our women's program that runs the crisis line and that does the primary advocacy. So when you are in our shelter, you get one primary advocate who's assigned to you, and they're the one that you kind of go to make sure that we're sorting out the legal, the medical needs, the emotional, mental health, wellness, and child care, and all of those things. So sometimes it takes the form of a case manager position. It depends on what the needs of the victim survivor are, really. And then we have a children's department that it ebbs and flows over the years. When it started, we were a daycare. And now it's gotten to the point to where our children's department has taken on a leadership role to really train in staff to never forget about children. We know that the mom is the mom of the children, and the mom is the one who is caring for her children. So we will never colonize our shelter participants by separating the children from their mother and caring for them ourselves. But we do need to understand what the mother needs in order to have access to her innate abilities to take care of the children. And sometimes when you're in a heightened state, the kids just have to sit there and be the kids they are, because you need to deal with your stuff. And so that's where we kind of understand our role. And when do we come in as backup, like a supportive friend, to say like, hey, you need someone to hang out with your kid for a little bit, but always going through mom to make sure that she's okay with how we're interacting with their children. So that's a little bit of the complexities of having a shelter environment. And we have a mental health therapist who's just phenomenal, and she helps us out in so many ways. So yeah, we're a busy organization of about 40 people.
Thank you, Lauren. So we're going to launch, this is the second to last poll. So this poll is about what are common concerns that people hold about living in a shelter. So things that you may have heard from people that you have worked with, or concerns that you have held yourself, just to learn a little bit more about that and see if we can help provide more perspective on these concerns. So a few weeks ago, I sent out an email to a lot of our staff asking for their experiences, to share their perspectives. And one of the questions was, what is a typical day at Women's Advocates like? A lot of people are, fearful of the unknown. So this is to kind of lower the veil a little bit, let people in to know more about what we do, what it looks like. So the little house image shows very common examples of how advocates and all of the different people that Lauren just described describe what a typical day for them is like. And I put this quote from one of our family advocates named Sam, and you can read that quote. I won't read it to you, but I think it really encompasses a lot of the different themes that came up of what it means to work at Women's Advocates. And so I'm looking at the poll. I'll share the results. So it seems like the unknown and then too many restrictions and rules are some of the biggest concerns, but also embarrassment, maybe worrying about accessibility or thinking that it's dangerous or concerned about communal living. Yeah, absolutely. I don't know, Lauren, if you want to talk about any of those concerns and what we've done to kind of address them. You can. If not, that's okay too.
Oh, it's complicated. I will say in terms of the communal living, it always depends on the house. You have at any given time 17 different victim survivors with their own unique circumstances, and it's, yeah, July can look entirely different from October, and we just kind of have to be as responsive and understanding as possible when there are problems. Sometimes there's amazing things that happen. You have someone with a leadership sentiment who heals through helping others, and then there's this new vibe that kind of happens, and we're all kind of working in sync, and there's a lot of energy. And then we'll have a bad day, and then all of us will crash, and we'll all just feel spent and exhausted, because we do kind of have that, not just a communal living space, but a communal shared sort of vibe or emotional tone that gets set. So definitely depends. It's been incredibly challenging with COVID complications, and that's certainly turned our operations on their head. So when we're talking about women's advocates, we're talking about non-pandemic women's advocates, because there's just no way to describe what the heck is going on right now.
Thank you, Lauren. So this next slide should give you a little bit more insight. These are things that you could even share with someone that you're working with who might ask, what is it like in a shelter, or why are they doing what they're doing? Why women's advocates even could be a question too. So these are just some responses that I've pulled from the quotes from our staff. So you can definitely read more about that. There's going to be a link at the end about our series where you can read all of the different excerpts. So these are just, so look out for that, but these are just little things for you to be aware of. Again, you'll receive these slides, so no worries if you weren't able to read all of this. We just want to make sure there's time for questions. Okay. So this next slide is about the evolution of the women's safety movement. I'm going to make a note to fix that. But safety comes first, so maybe that's why I put it first in the slide title. Anyway, Lauren already alluded to a lot of these different things. It's very similar and representative of kind of women's advocates. And before, so I guess again about language, when we're talking about the battered women's movement and hearing the mantra, the chant of "we will not be beaten," there's kind of a shift to what do we want. So again, still similarly, don't want to be beaten, but also we want to make sure that women are safe, right? So having that be at the center of the movement. So you'll see that Lauren already talked a lot about the non-cooperative criminal justice system and law enforcement, and seeing how can we replace that with different things like abuse transformation programs, going to the source of what the abuse is and trying to address that. making sure that we are in schools and workplaces and providing resources, prevention, and education. So when you go to the doctor, when you go to work, all these things that make you human, there are different people placed strategically in those different realms of your life. And they're able to equip you with the resources and the skills and the knowledge to either escape that situation or prevent it from happening in the first place. So we're hoping that we'll continue to dismantle these intersecting oppressive systems and mobilize the community to respond to domestic violence and support survivors in different ways as well. So these are just some, I'm keeping this one brief because I think Lauren covered a lot of this. So let us know if you have any other questions about this evolution and where we're going in the future. It looks like there is a question from Maria about the shelter I work at has a children's advocacy program. Throughout the years, we have struggled with getting moms to have children participate in children's advocacy program. Any suggestions? Absolutely. So we sent in our email. So that is a big topic, and there's a lot of different layers to that. We can connect you with our different children's advocates as well. So please send us an email. We won't get into it too much, but we absolutely have suggestions and would love to connect with you. Okay, we're almost to the end here.
So yes, cusp. One thing before I get into the the cusp description, I giggle because at the time this was a very, very serious subject about, you can't beat us, we will not be beaten. But they still had a sense of humor about things. And there were these mugs that were being made back in the early 80s. And it had a thing said, "Women, you can't beat them." And it was a double, they had two messages in one. And so depending on how you thought about it, but it was, you could tell that they needed a way to kind of give themselves some levity in the midst of a very difficult subject matter and a life or death sort of a situation. So, we're still humans and we still have moments where we just need to giggle with each other and laugh a little bit and have some positivity moments just to kind of get through the day, the week, the month, the year. CUSP, it's called the Collective for Uplifting Survivors and Peacemakers. This group is, we kind of were born out of the, when we originally started doing the research about what Women's Advocates was doing 45 years ago with a collective, the collective model, in the sense that this isn't a government-funded hierarchical organization that is intended to dole out resources as much as we are allowed to based off of our governmental funding. And it's really more of a consciousness raising effort when we began. And so we kind of collected a lot of voices from around town to see what mistakes did we make back 45 years ago. One significant mistake was that in a town with so many different people and so many different backgrounds, the voices that were most elevated were the white voices. Another element was that it was a specific, it was a lot of college educated women who were coming together who just wanted to do something helpful. And a lot of the people who were part of the movement weren't necessarily survivors themselves locally here. They just saw that it was a problem and they needed to fix it. So this is kind of our second way and our second run of saying, okay, what lessons did we need to learn from back then? We need to be multi-generational. We need to have a variety of voices from a variety of backgrounds and a variety of preferences in terms of how much we involve law enforcement in our efforts, what other community strengths and movements are happening now that we can engage with and participate. And so as a group, there's probably about 20 of us, so usually about 15 at a time end up showing up to our ongoing meetings. Now we do them via Zoom. But we are a group of community members and we seek to mobilize a community response to the lack of sufficient safety and basic resources of survivors of sexual relationship and family violence. Sometimes we get a little bit ahead of ourselves as a movement and we think we've been doing this for so long, let's seek to prevent this from ever happening. And we're jumping over the Native women who are actively being hurt and not seeing any justice, the type of justice that we were fighting for 45 years ago. We are seeing a lot of Black women who are not getting the sort of justice that they seek, and in fact are pushed further into the criminal system through this. So we need to back up and we need to kind of start over again, seeing the systemic solutions to not only preventing the perpetuation of gender-based violence, but urging increased accountabilities to the system that allow the perpetrators of this violence to continue, and also increasing housing and economic and resource justice for survivors of gender-based violence. So that's a big mouthful, but essentially what it is people who have survived either the movement or survived domestic violence or sexual assault or other injustices in the community. And we get together and we talk about who's missing in this movement. And we talk about what we need to do to really bring them to the forefront, and to start over again and to prioritize some of the most marginalized and vulnerable populations that are being forgotten about. Another group that we can talk about are elderly people. When we talk about the domestic violence movement, we don't often go to people in the third stage of their lives. But when you look at the femicide report in Minnesota specifically, you'll see that age does not determine when you fall victim to homicide that is resulting of intimate partner violence. So we take a very sober approach to who is being hurt, and we're going back to that pain point. We really are. But we're doing it by making sure voices are heard that typically would have been snuffed out over the years. So it's a second start, and it's really meaningful to get together with people and just kind of share our stories with each other. So yeah, it's and if anyone wants the description of our group, I'm happy to send it. And you know, just because this is the sort of thing that we don't want to isolate from other people, because it seems to be a really healthy experience for those who participate.
So this next slide is just for you to reference other Minnesota-based organizations to know about. We're not alone. So you'll receive the slide so you can check out all of these other wonderful organizations that we often collaborate and partner with. So lastly, we want to share that we do have a very comprehensive kind of resource hub. So this is the link, and I'll send it out in the email as well. These are some examples. Oh, you can't see it. These are some examples of the resources that we have, different trifolds that you can download and print out or share with others. We also, this is not 90 pages now, it's over 100 pages of a bunch of resources. So please feel free to check those out. Below are some examples of how you can give a warm referral to a place like Women's Advocates. So if you aren't familiar with how to do that, that's just some information on there. So we highly recommend that you check out our resource hub. And then the next slide is a little bit more about how to support our organization. So with this, there's links to donate, to volunteer, different ways to advocate for safety. And then the next slide here is if you want to continue learning about us and relevant issues, you can check out our mini documentary series with TPT. We have a lot of different resources for you to learn more, so please check out those links. We have quite a few more webinars remaining for this month. So if you haven't registered for those, register for any that you are interested in. Some of the things that may have been missing from this webinar will be addressed in future webinars or previous ones. So that is all. We would like to open it up for questions. We do acknowledge we are about 2 minutes till 11, so we understand if people have to go on to other things in their day. But this is a specific opportunity for everyone to ask any questions that they have that came up during the webinar. When you exit the webinar, you will see a survey pop up. If you could fill out that survey, that'd be really great. It really helps us to improve and learn more about if the community is in need of learning more information that we provided in the webinar. We also have our contact information on the screen if you want to follow up, send us any emails, add our crisis line number to your phone. We also want to advertise that we do have a live chat too. So on our website, if you ever have any questions and you need to connect quickly with an advocate, you can go on our website, do a live chat. You can encourage people that you're working with to use the live chat function too if they aren't able to call our crisis line. Okay, well, thank you all so much for taking some time out of your day to join us, to be here with us. I'll remain on for a few more minutes just in case there's any lingering questions, but you'll receive an email from us where you can respond with anything that you may have forgotten. But thank you so much for being here. I'm going to stop the recording.